Assalamualaikum dan selamat pagi. Anda bersama saya Nabilah Khaleeda dan ini Niaga AWANI. Kita mulakan dengan perkembangan ini berkenaan dengan JS-SEZ di mana Pemeterian Perjanjian Zon Ekonomi Khas Johor Singapura dapat memacu integrasi ekonomi secara lebih ketara selain memangkin pertumbuhan dan menggalakkan penyertaan ekonomi yang lebih besar bagi Malaysia dan Republik itu. Presiden merangkap Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Kumpulan Malayan Banking Berhad Maybank, Datuk Khairul Ramli berkata, perjanjian itu juga dijangka mewujudkan lebih banyak peluang pekerjaan, meningkatkan perdagangan intra-serantau selain memperkasa daya tahan rantau ini sebagai sebuah blok ekonomi. Tambahnya, firma itu juga melihat potensi pertumbuhan lebih kukuh dalam industri halal di JS-SEZ yang dapat menyediakan perkhidmatan untuk pasaran global. Menjelaskan selanjutnya, Khairul berkata apabila JS-SEZ dapat direalisasikan dan seterusnya memudahkan pergerakan barangan dan orang ramai, Maybank selaku bank keempat terbesar dari segi aset di Asia Tenggara menjagakan pertumbuhan kukuh dalam pembayaran rentas sempadan. Bank itu melihat peningkatan jumlah transaksi rentas sempadan yang memberangsangkan iaitu hampir 60% daripada 229,900 pada akhir 2023 kepada 336,700 pada 2024. Penyedia Perkhidmatan Pos dan Bungkusan Nasional Pos Malaysia Berhad mengumumkan pelantikan Natalia Ahmad Shukri Navin sebagai Ketua Pegawai Sumber Manusia Kumpulan Baharu Berkuat Kuasa 2 Januari 2025. Beliau akan melaporkan diri kepada Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Kumpulan Charles Brewer. Petronas menerusi Malaysia Petroleum Management MPM dengan kerjasama Besar Friendlab Asia memulakan kajian lembangan persepadu untuk meneroka sumber yang belum diterokai di lembangan Melayu yang terletak di luar pantai semenanjung Malaysia. Kajian itu memanfaatkan pemodelan 4D dan teknologi pembelajaran mesin canggih bagi menganalisis seni bina bawah permukaan bagi kedua-dua skala lembangan dan takungan. UMW Toyota Motor Sdn Bhd UMWT menutup tahun 2024 dengan momentum jualan yang kukuh, merekodkan lebih 12,800 unit terjual pada Disember 2024, menjadikan jumlah keseluruhan unit terjual melebihi 102,300 unit. Rekod itu menjadikan 2024 sebagai tahun ketiga berturut-turut UMWT melepasi sasaran 100,000 unit dalam tempoh setahun, satu pencapaian penting yang belum pernah dicapai sebelum ini oleh syarikat tersebut. Laporan penuh di saluran 501 dan AWANI.com serta daganus.com. BMIDF Amanah Investment Bank Berhad berpendapat bahawa Zon Ekonomi Khas Johor Singapura JS-SEZ berpotensi menjadi hub strategik berdasarkan sambungannya ke pelabuhan Johor dan Singapura yang menyediakan ketersambungan serantau serta global. Cabang pendidikannya MIDF Research berkata produk yang dikeluarkan di JS-SEZ boleh dieksport melalui kedua-dua pelabuhan.
Pelabuhan Singapura menghubungkan lebih daripada 600 pelabuhan di 130 negara, menjadikannya sebagai salah satu daripada pelabuhan perkapalan global yang paling berkaitan. Selain itu, katanya pelabuhan tersebut secara konsisten menduduki tempat teratas di dunia untuk pemprosesan kontena antara lain. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim serta Perdana Menteri Singapura Lawrence Wong menyaksikan pertukaran perjanjian bersama antara Malaysia dan Singapura mengenai JS-SEZ di samping 6 memorandum persefahaman dan 1 surat niat. Menteri Ekonomi Rafizi Ramli sebelum ini berkata JS-SEZ akan meliputi seluruh kawasan Iskandar Malaysia termasuk kawasan di bawah pentadbiran Majlis Perbandaran Pengerang dengan keseluruhannya berkeluasan 3,505 km persegi. JS-SEZ merangkumi kawasan di bawah 6 pihak berkuasa tempatan di Johor iaitu Majlis Bandaraya Iskandar Puteri, Majlis Bandaraya Johor Bahru, Majlis Bandaraya Pasir Gudang, Majlis Perbandaran Kulai, Majlis Perbandaran Pengerang dan sebahagian daripada Majlis Perbandaran Pontian. MIDF Research berkata pelabuhan Johor dihubungkan dengan baik melalui jalan raya serta kereta api ke seluruh Malaysia dan Singapura memudahkan pergerakan barangan dan bahan. Katanya peningkatan pengeluaran di kawasan-kawasan ini termasuk kekuatan perhubungan akan mengukuhkan lagi aktiviti ekspor Malaysia. Selain itu berkata JS-SEZ akan menawarkan pelabur pilihan terbaik dari kedua-dua negara dengan akses kepada kecanggihan Singapura serta kelebihan kos dan sumber yang ditawarkan Johor. Johor menyediakan kelebihan dalam hartanah dan kos buruh yang mana banyak perusahaan dijangka tertarik memandangkan lokasi serta ketesambungannya. Johor menyediakan kelebihan dalam hartanah dan kos buruh yang mana banyak perusahaan dijangka tertarik memandangkan lokasi serta ketesambungannya.
Alright, right now we're in the segment of AWANI Green Action where Malaysia is at a critical point in its journey towards a green transition, and Malaysia's green industrial base has the potential to tackle worsening environmental crisis. However, challenges in technological upgrading persist. So Khazanah Research Institute or KRI's latest publication that's called Building a Sustainable Industrial Base, Malaysia's Green Transition by Azfar Hanif Azizi and Yin Shaolong delves into the challenges facing our industries. So to discuss further, joining me on the line is Azfar Hanif himself, the Research Associate for Khazanah Research Institute KRI. So mungkin firstly, Azfar, could you help us understand better on what are the key challenges Malaysia faces in building a green industry? If you could at least lay out one by one based on your recent research.
Hi, good morning, Nabilah. I'll be great. It'll be great if I can lay down one by one the challenges that we discussed in our paper. So firstly, the first challenge that we discussed was, in chasing too much of a mitigation strategy. So mitigation is basically we're trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So too much of doing that actually might, too much focus of policy of doing that might ignore another component of climate to tackle the climate change, which is adaptation. So focusing too much on climate mitigation without looking at climate adaptation poses risks on green industrialization itself, because right now the effect of climate change has already, some of it has been locked in. So certain adaptations have to be done in order for industries and firms to survive. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is the challenge of deindustrialization. So deindustrialization, we have pointed out why this is a challenge is that because when the industrial base of a country goes through deindustrialization, you might see some firms close down and bankrupt, and that means technological capabilities that were in the firm as well would also disappear, and that it also, with the disappearance of the firm, it also leads to less demand for workers, and your technological capabilities also would disappear. The third challenge that we've identified is industrial policy constraints. So this is due to the fact that we are in an era of free trade, well, at least from the 1990s to late 2010s, and now we're seeing a shift towards more protectionist policies by developed countries. But still, we are still part of the World Trade Organization. We have signed free trade agreements, and this imposes certain barriers on us to implement industrial policy strategies. So like in the past, countries that are currently developed, they could implement industrial policies to support their firms and support their industries, like giving direct subsidies, put export promotion and things sort of like that. So right now, for us in this current era and the fact that we signed so many FTAs, it imposes barriers for us to adopt those kind of policies. The fourth constraint, the fourth challenge that we've identified is actually fiscal policy constraint. As we know that ever since 2000, after the GFC, the financial crisis of 2008, successive governments after that have tried to reduce the fiscal deficit, right, because of our relatively high debt levels or the concern over government debt levels. So when government tries to reduce the fiscal spending, what happens is we have less money to spend on industrial policies, on policies that we can still currently do under the current regime. So the fiscal constraints also affect that. Next, we have the next challenge that I've also identified in the paper is the talent issues. So we have a shortage of talent for ambitious upgrading or for optimistic projections of FDI coming in. But at the same time, currently our talent are underemployed. So there's a mismatch of claims, but this mismatch of claims is more about a coordination issue. We have currently a lot of E&E graduates are underemployed because of a decrease in R&D spending. But at the same time, we are also optimistic that the E&E industry will grow, and then we need this talent to upgrade. So there's a coordination problem there. The next challenge that we also identified is weaknesses in supporting R&D institutions. So if we we've tried to benchmark ourselves to more successful countries like Taiwan and Korea. So their best practice was to try and adopt technologies from available technologies from other countries and try to adapt them to the local conditions and let the local firms to try and adopt them. So in our context, we have not done that so successfully. And then in our R&D institutions mostly try to focus on commercialization of their own R&D products. So, and then I think our focus should be more on trying to adapt these technologies from overseas because we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and then try to let our local firms adopt it. And then the last challenge that we've identified is the lack of big indigenous firms investing in technological development. So even though right now Malaysia does have a lot of big firms, but big firms don't really invest in technological development. So why big firms are important is because depending too much on FDI does not really allow us to technologically upgrade. If you have time, we can discuss that later.
Thank you for laying out one by one of these challenges. Maybe if I could ask you, which one of these challenges should be addressed most urgently to ensure rapid progress? Because we know we can't move everything all at once. So what's your opinion on this?
So the challenges that I think that we should immediately address is on the fiscal constraints and the industrial policy constraints. So fiscal constraints and industrial policy constraints are on the constraints on ability to act. So for you to act, you need to have the ability first. So if you have, if you're fiscally unconstrained, I'm not going to say fiscally unconstrained, if you have more money to spend, and then you have capability to spend in the sense that you can spend on different industrial policy instruments, then then once this is available, then you can implement the industrial policy, which would solve most of the other problems. It could solve the capability building problem, and it could solve the talent problem as well. So the fiscal policy constraints and the industrial policy constraints are the challenges I would say that are most important right now.
And there's one mention that in your research about marginalized communities such as Orang Asli. So what measures are being considered to ensure that marginalized communities like Orang Asli are actually can be involved and also not left behind in this green transition?
Right. We have discussed the situation of Orang Asli in their marginalization or industrialization and development in general in our paper. So with the case of Orang Asli, they are deprived in terms of education, poverty, and health. And these three factors, I think, are interrelated to one another, with poor outcomes in health are likely to influence poor outcomes in education and poverty, or the other way around as well. Poor outcomes in education likely to influence poor outcomes in education and poverty. So with the Orang Asli, the government, state government, the federal governments should try to address a lot of their immediate concerns. You know, a lot of it has to do with their infrastructure, the provision of education, electricity, clean water. We have to solve those issues. We have to pay people who provide services to Orang Asli better. So that's one of it. And then if we're going to look at affirmative action policies for them, we should try to specify a category just for them, because if we just look at Bumi Putra in general, it might not capture their situation. So there's that. And also, when we want to include them in development, we have to respect their rights, and we have to obtain their, basically, we have to obtain, it has to be out of their own volition. We cannot force them.
Frankly speaking, as far if we want to move forward and move, shall we say, bigger, we somehow have to rely by the larger and more competitive global players. But to what extent Malaysia should rely on foreign investments versus strengthening its domestic capabilities in building a green, reliable industrial base for a longer term?
Right. So reliance on foreign direct investment is good if for a developing country who is just starting out and they don't have capabilities in manufacturing. So when you're just a country just starting out, your people are mostly still peasants, and then you're trying to modernize the economy, then bringing in a foreign direct investment to establish firms in the country is a good thing, because first it provides jobs, and then it can introduce some basic capabilities of manufacturing, of organizing things. It can also introduce some knowledge spillovers and some learning. But at a certain stage, usually when a country becomes a middle income already, then depending on FDI might actually prolong your situation in a low value-added production. So at a certain extent, once you become a middle income, and then when wages are being pushed up already, I think that is the time when we should not depend too much on FDI. We should then focus on building our own capabilities, because when you have a firm, a local firm linked to a foreign company as well, what could happen is that they can depress how much you can mark up on the services that you provide for them. So that markup reduces how much you can pay your workers and how much you can price your product. And then that dependency could also lead you to delinking, when if you try to upgrade your own products and then the FDI partner tells you not to, or tries to prevent you from competing with them. So it leaves you isolated. So what we should do is actually develop our own capabilities. In Malaysia's case, we don't really need to link, we don't need to have FDI to teach us basic capabilities, because we have reached the stage where we have a lot of our own companies, we have a lot of companies with basic project execution capabilities, with engineering capabilities. So we have those basic capabilities. And then we have companies that are of a certain size that can probably start investing. So for Malaysia, one of the things is perhaps we should focus on encouraging our big firms to start investing in technological goods. The advantages of big firms is that. Sorry?
To sum everything up, sorry, we don't have much time. Our time's up.
Okay.
So to sum up, I can say that despite all these challenges, Malaysia's green transition is an opportunity to build a sustainable, tech-driven economy, and I hope we can ensure it benefits everyone as well. So thank you so much, I would say, to Azfar Hanif Azizi, Khazanah Research Institute's Research Associate. So we have a lot more to cover after this. We'll go for a short break. We'll be right back.
Sambut Tahun Baharu bersama kami. Di sinilah kisah kita bermula. Kisah yang meraihkan kehidupan.
Full of life and flavour.
Kisah yang membuat kita tabah.
Tell them the truth.
了解黑幕上，再见，动不了。
生命是靠争取的。
The truth is always stranger than fiction.
Kisah yang mendorong kita.
太拘束，安排这个什么的。
Kisah yang membentuk kita.
It's like the dreams come true.
We do make a pretty good team when we work together.
Being the Dragon Warrior, it's who I am.
Kisah yang mendebarkan jiwa. Ini kisah kita.
No matter where history began, they end with one hell of a story.
Stream kesemuanya bila-bila masa, apa jua cara. Semuanya di satu tempat.
Bertemu kembali. Sasaran seramai 35.6 juta pelawat antarabangsa sebenarnya tahun melawat Malaysia 2026 adalah jumlah realistik yang mampu dicapai. Profesor Ajung Fakulti Hospitality, Pelancongan dan Kesejahteraan Universiti Malaya Kelantan, Datuk Azli Halim berpendapat Malaysia patut menjadikan Thailand sebagai contoh kerana negara itu terbukti menarik lebih 35 juta pelancong pada 2024.
Begitu juga dalam fokus kita kepada pasaran sasaran. Contohnya Thailand, dia memberi tumpuan kepada negara China, Eropah, India, khususnya dalam sektor promosi yang related kepada produk-produk mereka. Jadi ini juga kita boleh ambil iktibar ataupun belajar daripada macam mana kita nak mengukuhkan usaha untuk menarik pelancong dari pasaran yang sama. Khususnya seperti pasaran negara Timur Tengah. Apa yang mereka tertarik? Mungkin daripada promosi Islamik, pelancongan Islamik ataupun halal. Ini kita mungkin boleh kita perhalusi.
Azli yang berkongsi pandangan dalam agenda AWANI pada Selasa berkata, perkara asas yang Thailand mampu tawarkan adalah perkhidmatan dan layanan mesra kepada pelancong. Tambahnya lagi, perkara paling penting bagi memastikan pelancong merasai pengalaman menarik ketika berada di negara ini, aspek kebersihan harus diutamakan kerana ia cerminan mentaliti rakyat. Sebelum ini, Kementerian Pelancongan, Seni dan Budaya Motek meletakkan sasaran ketibaan seramai 35.6 juta pelawat antarabangsa dengan menjana nilai 147.1 bilion ringgit sempena tahun melawat Malaysia 2026.
Malaysia menyokong komitmen Indonesia untuk meneruskan mandat biodiesel B40 pada tahun ini. Menurut Menteri Peladangan dan Komoditi Datuk Seri Johari Abdul Ghani, langkah dilakukan Indonesia itu secara tidak langsung membantu industri minyak sawit dalam mengurangkan tekanan harga pasaran.
Well, basically, Indonesia, we should be grateful for Indonesia because they produce about 48 million metric ton and they use almost 25% of that for their biodiesel. So that in itself has helped the industry. You imagine kalau dia tak pakai the biodiesel, so you end up that 25% have to go to the world. So there will be a pressure on the price.
Beliau berkata demikian dalam sidang media selepas majlis menandatangani memorandum kolaborasi antara FGV Holdings Berhad dan Lembaga Minyak Sawit Malaysia MPOB di Kuala Lumpur pada Selasa. Kerjasama ini antaranya bagi menyokong pekebun kecil dalam mematuhi piawaian minyak sawit lestari Malaysia MSPO dan syarat kebolehjejakan ditetapkan Peraturan Penembangan Hutan Kesatuan Eropah. Dalam masa sama, Johari turut menyarankan golongan pekebun kecil kelapa sawit meningkatkan kadar pengeluaran hasil antara 5 hingga 10 tan metrik setahun kerana ia boleh melonjakkan penghasilan minyak sawit mentah CPO kepada hingga 2.5 juta tan metrik bagi tempoh sama. Indonesia sebelum ini dilaporkan akan mula melaksanakan campuran biodiesel mandatory 40% dengan bahan api berasaskan minyak sawit atau B40 pada 1 Januari lalu. Bagaimanapun, ia masih belum dilaksanakan seperti yang dirancang kerana peserta industri masih menunggu butiran teknikal peraturan baharu. Indonesia sebagai pengeluar minyak sawit terbesar dunia kini menggunakan B35 campuran 35% biodiesel berasaskan minyak sawit.
Forum Ekonomi Dunia WEF menjangka lebih banyak tumpuan akan diberikan kepada tarif dan dasar industri pada penggal kedua kepresidenan Donald Trump. Presiden dan ketua pegawai eksekutifnya Borch Brandon berkata hubungan Amerika Syarikat dan China dijangka berdepan cabaran besar sepanjang 4 tahun akan datang iaitu di bawah pentadbiran Trump. Trump dan naib presidennya JD Vance akan mengangkat sumpah pada 20 Januari 2025. Menurut Borge, perkara ini akan menjadi menarik untuk dilihat bagaimana ia berkembang kerana kedua-dua ekonomi ini saling terintegrasi. Namun tawarnya ekspor China kini dilihat tidak bergantung sepenuhnya pada pasaran Amerika Syarikat seperti dahulu. Boleh menambah beberapa tahun lalu, 25% ekspor China pergi ke Amerika Syarikat, namun kini angka itu adalah 12% hingga 13%. Beliau menjawab soalan mengenai impak penggal kedua Trump terhadap kerjasama global memandangkan presiden yang dipilih itu bukan penyokong besar institusi dan perjanjian multilateral. Brady berkata terdapat fenomena negara sekutu politik dan ekonomi apabila syarikat yang bersaing juga bekerjasama dalam beberapa bidang. Tambahnya ini adalah perkara yang perlu dunia biasakan dalam peraturan dunia baharu. Terdahulu, Brady berkata kos untuk dunia yang tidak bersepadu adalah tinggi. Sebagai contoh, di bahagian perdagangan, jika kita melihat dunia yang tidak bersepadu dalam perdagangan, ia boleh menyebabkan penurunan 7.0 hingga 8.0% dalam produk domestik kasar global. Namun beliau berpendapat situasi tidak akan sampai ke tahap berkenaan. Sebaliknya, Global Cooperation Barometer ini menunjukkan negara dunia perlu terus mencari kaedah untuk bekerjasama. Dalam laporan tersebut, WEF berkata, kerjasama global secara keseluruhan yang menunjukkan aliran positif sepanjang sebahagian besar dekad lepas tersekat akibat ketegangan geopolitik yang semakin meningkat selain persaingan yang menghakis keselamatan kolektif global. Ia berkata situasi tidak berubah tersebut didorong oleh kemerosotan mendadak dalam tonggak keamanan serta keselamatan yang dinilai menerusi barometer Taitullah, satu alat penilaian yang dibangunkan dengan kerjasama McKinsey Company. Sehubungan itu, organisasi yang berpusat di Geneva itu berkata, tahap konflik dan krisis kemanusiaan yang berkaitan meningkat pada tahun lepas ke satu tahap rekod baharu dipacu oleh krisis-krisis termasuk di Timur Tengah, Ukraine dan Sudan. Baik, Niagawan ini akan terus bersiaran sehingga jam 10.30 pagi. Jadi banyak lagi perkembangan selepas ini. Kita berhenti rehat seketika, kembali selepas ini.
Sambut Tahun Baharu bersama kami. Di sinilah kisah kita bermula. Kisah yang meraihkan kehidupan.
Full of life and flavour.
Kisah yang membuat kita tabah.
Tell them the truth.
不要讲黑幕上，再讲动不会老。
生命是靠争取的。
இதெல்லாம் பார்க்கறதுக்கான திரும்பி உயிரோட வந்தேன்.
The truth is always stranger than fiction.
Kisah yang mendorong kita.
太拘束，安排这个死的。
Kisah yang membentuk kita.
It's like the dreams come true.
We do make a pretty good team when we work together.
Being the Dragon Warrior, it's who I am.
Kisah yang mendebarkan jiwa. Ini kisah kita.
No matter where history began, they end with one hell of a story.
Stream kesemuanya bila-bila masa, apa jua cara. Semuanya di satu tempat.
Southeast Asia startup ecosystem is booming, but a shift is underway. While traditional models prioritize a rapid scaling and revenue growth, a new wave of entrepreneurs are focused on building ethical and sustainable business that align with community values, especially Halal principles. As the market matures, the challenges is clear. How can startups remain profitable while staying true to their ethical values and contributing positively to their communities? And today we explore how startups can balance revenue pressures with ethical integrity, the role of accelerator programs like Halal VC in guiding these ventures, and how understanding local dynamics can help businesses grow sustainable. And for that, I welcome you, our guest, Umar Munshi, the managing partner, Halal VC. I want to say thank you very much, Umar, for joining me. Firstly, you want to take a look the main challenge, especially for the startups. What are some of the issues, challenges that they have encountered when trying to achieve profitability while staying true to their ethics and halal principles?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And maybe I'll start off by sharing that in our perspective, in our understanding, upholding and fulfilling halal principles is not necessarily something that affects success and profitability. Right? Although there would be a case, or sometimes there would be cases where certain products or certain markets or certain services that may not comply or may not be aligned with halal principles. For those, the startups and companies may have to not be involved or not serve that particular market. But in general, we see that halal principles generally ethical principles that can be universally applied. And when businesses subscribe to such ethics, this actually creates more value and more sustainability, and potentially it can also help in the growth aspect of the startup.
Umar, maybe you can share with us, are there any successful example that startup entrepreneurs have successfully balanced it, and what are the key decisions or the key approaches that enable them to succeed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are actually many companies. The thing about halal is you can brand yourself as halal, or you can be silent about it and just ensure that you subscribe to halal principles, which, as I mentioned earlier, in most cases would be considered universal. Now, what we see and in our experience and what we share to the startups that we invest in is that look at the substance, the value of what you're offering and communicate it effectively. Right? Whether it's the ethical halal component or it is more on the business value, that communication is key, right? Not just asserting halal, but why halal or what about halal. Yeah? So in that case, it could be something that creates benefit to society, something that prevents harm, something that brings more. For example, halal, something that's halal can also be more inclusive because you can have those of the Muslim faith as well as those of other faiths involved.
Mm-hmm. And Umar, what are the common pitfalls that halal businesses face when scaling, especially, and how can they avoid compromising their values in the pursuit of growth amid uncertainties?
Yeah, I think a major challenge which we are trying to solve is that Malaysia, although Islamic finance is very developed, is number one Islamic finance, Islamic economy or halal hub in the world, but there's almost no or very little halal VC. So when halal companies want to scale, they necessarily need halal funding as well, right? That's where we see that there is a challenge or there is a gap in the market. There is this lack of halal VC, halal investors for a long time. However, at the same time, the silver lining is that we can see today that even major global VC brands and franchises are starting to invest in halal startups. So while it is still a challenge, steps are being taken towards solving it.
And talking about VC, Umar, we know that the recent news about tightening the VC funding environment, what are the challenges that you have observed in the industries which are impacting most of the fundraising?
Maybe I can identify two factors or two challenges. One is a general lack of exposure and understanding of VC by stakeholders. When I say stakeholders, I include the public as well. Right? As we are aware, there's some high-profile negative cases recently and in the past. And the thing about VC is that it's a very unique, I would say maybe counterintuitive kind of investment, where you expect most of your investments to actually fail and only a small portion of it to actually give you your returns. So that is something that not many are familiar with or comfortable with, but that is something that is inherent within the whole concept and approach of startups and VC investment, right? So that understanding needs to be enhanced so that there can be more harmony and more synergy in the ecosystem. Yeah, and the other aspect I believe is the mindset towards failure and risk taking, because that is the name of the game in venture capital. While there is definitely a duty of care and responsibility towards investors when founders receive investment, but at the same time, investors need to go in with their eyes open, and the stakeholders need to understand that the reality is that the chances of success is not usually very high, and that small portion of the companies that we invest in that do make it big, that's where the VC value is really unlocked.
And also factoring that VC is becoming more competitive, do you think it's going to be very hard, or it's going to become harder for ethical business to secure investment? And how do they overcome all of these barriers?
Yeah. On the contrary, I think and I believe that the opportunity today for startup entrepreneurship, technology entrepreneurship, it's actually much more open and much more accessible to entrepreneurs because of the way that things have become democratized in terms of technology. A non-tech background person can start a tech business, right? And a techie person can learn to do business. And today we have, of course, tools like AI and so on that make it much, much cheaper and much easier to start a business. So I think the barriers to starting a business has gone down very, very significantly. And that makes it more capital efficient. You don't need so much money. And so, VCs or whatever capital stock is available can be spread out to a lot more companies. So I think and I believe and I hope that it's actually going to be easier moving forward to raise funds, but the funds will be smaller because you don't need so much money to run a business.
And that is a situation from entrepreneurs and venture capitals. And in Malaysia, probably we can relate it into the global context. What are some of the trends you anticipate will shape the future of venture capital in Malaysia in the coming years?
Right. Two very clear trends that we can see. There are many, but maybe I'll highlight these two. One is the trend towards having businesses that are more people-focused, human-focused, society or community-focused. Meaning it's to benefit a larger group of people, right? You can call it impact investment, socially responsible investment, and so on. And this is where the halal aspect also comes into play, because the halal paradigm and framework is something that is very well developed and well set, and Muslims, non-Muslims alike can subscribe to that. The other that I see is related to my earlier point, where you can start and grow a business with very few people and very few resources. So this kind of, maybe we can call it micro entrepreneurship, although we're not talking about microfinance, we're talking about startups. You can have very small, very lean startups that can do big things and reach a certain scale before it needs to raise significant funds.
That is also the trends in the coming years for Malaysia to take a look on. And if I'm going to bring to a larger context, especially within the international, we can see, given the global economics uncertainty, do you see any shift in the investor preference? Are they more keen on ethical or sustainable business model?
Yes, definitely. I mean, as the world changes and continues to change, and the speed of change is only accelerating, right? Consumer preferences change, business preferences change, and the lens of doing things or subscribing to businesses or products, which has ethics and morals that are aligned to our own values, that has become so prominent and so important today with the BDS movement and so on. So, necessarily, startups need to move in that direction, and investors will also match that trend. We've really seen that happening around the world. Malaysia, I feel, is a very suitable hub, a very suitable place for such ethical startups to be born.
Given about the venture capital trends in Malaysia and the global trends, and also I want to take a look on the government's role of the governments. How can the policy we play part in shaping the trends, and how should the startups prepare for any of regulatory changes?
All right. It's always a little bit challenging, I guess, for the government to really get involved in startups. But it definitely needs to happen, right? And in Malaysia, there's so much support from the government. It's really quite amazing. Because for us, we work with startups in many different countries in the region, and Malaysia is definitely up there in terms of support in general. I think what can be enhanced or improved is more engagement at the grassroots levels, and also a mindset that you want new people, you want new challenges, right? You want a new type of people involved, or new type of institutions involved, right? So the so-called traditional or typical channels in which government fund, government support trickles down and reaches the masses, I think there needs to be a little bit more flexibility and openness to have different people and different entities involved. Because as I mentioned earlier on, the mindset in VC is very different, and the value they can unlock in VC with that different mindset is very, very significant.
And Umar, I also want to hear a little bit about your advice on what will you give to startups, founders and even entrepreneurs in fundraising while upholding their ethical values, especially because we want to get it right. How can founders, entrepreneurs ensure they attract the right kind of investment, especially that aligns with their ethical values, and particularly in industries that might not prioritize or consider all of this aspect?
Yeah, this is, it can be very tricky because myself, I'm a founder, an entrepreneur for more than 20 years. Before I became an investor, a VC. Yeah, okay. So I've been in that, I've been wearing the hat for most of my career, most of my business life. And it is very, very tricky sometimes, right? Definitely you should, as a founder, make it clear what your principles are, what your preferences are, what's your stand, what's your culture, in your deck, in your presentation, in the material that you share with your investor, right? So that the investor can benchmark and understand that you are this kind of company, or this is your preference and your approach. And that should be able to help you attract the right kind of investors, more than those that you may not want. But at the same time, it's always tricky to know, upfront, to try and figure out whether the investor is right for you. And in a startup environment, sometimes, especially today, the startups are chasing the investors, right? So my suggestion would be, take it, fundamentally in a way that you understand what you're getting into. Don't just get excited when you have an offer for money, or a VC is interested in you. But try to look at that VC's background, who they've invested in, who are the people behind the VC or the investor, before you take the step and receive their money.
In a very highly competitive fundraising environment, what strategies, what kind of innovative approach can be used by the founders, entrepreneurs to build a very strong ethical value that resonates with the investors?
Right. So indeed, as you pointed out, it is currently very, very competitive when it comes to raising funds, right? Or in other words, it's quite challenging, it's quite difficult. A few things that founders can do. One is to really focus and zoom in on the key value proposition that you provide in the specific context of solving your problem, solving the problem for your customer. That's very, very critical. A lot of times, startups are trying to solve a problem that may not really exist or that people are not willing to pay to get solved. So there's a very basic fundamental thing that, in general, all startup founders would do well to remind yourselves, and I also remind myself about that a lot. The second thing is capital efficiency and sustainability. What I mean by that is show that you can create value and, if possible, even generate revenue. And best, if you can even do your business in a way that you can generate more revenue than your costs, meaning your cash flow positive. If you can do that at an early stage or at a young stage, then that will actually set you apart, right? There is a trade-off sometimes between trying to grow as fast as you can and looking after your bottom line, right? But if you can strike that balance, and if you can show investors that I have reached this point, I don't need money to survive, but I would like your investment so I can go to another level, then that is something that investors would be interested in, because it shows that you can reach some point of stability even without additional external capital, and that will put you in a different category, right? So it's not easy, but it's something that we have seen happen a lot. In fact, this year we invested in 10 companies, half of them, almost half from Malaysia, and the rest from Indonesia and other countries. And most of them at pre-seed, which is early stage, almost sustainable, and some are already cash flow positive. So I was very surprised and happily surprised to see this, and that's also why we chose to invest in them.
And definitely, you've said that it's not easy, but it's possible. And we know that from easy to possible, that also made it happen is also from the support of accelerator programs like Hassan VC. And how can we understand that accelerator programs like Hassan VC assist startups in navigating local market conditions while ensuring they maintain their ethical practices?
Right. Every accelerator has its own strength, and there are many, many accelerator programs out there. So you need to see, what's the potential value you can gain when you apply for an accelerator. And for Hassan, maybe I can highlight two things. One, the unique content and the trainers and speakers that we bring to our accelerator program from Malaysia and from outside Malaysia. The focus is, of course, on business principles, fundamentals, scaling up, and so on. But very much so, we also embed the Islamic worldview, in this case, of doing good, of barakah, or having blessings in what you do. Because when we do something that brings benefit to others, it circulates benefit in that sense, right? So that's a very unique and important part of our content. The second one that I want to highlight is the community. Right? So by virtue of our positioning and our content and our concept, which is Hassan means good. The word Hassan means good. So we're here to do good. We're here to help startups do good commercially and also from an ethical point of view. So that attracts founders and community members that think in a similar way. So when you join our accelerator, or when you are accepted into our accelerator, then you are part of this wider community, and that peer support and those relationships and bonds that we develop over time is something that creates tremendous value for a lot of our founders.
As the managing director as one of the accelerator programs, maybe you can show the experience of the journey. What are some of the common ethical dilemmas that most of the entrepreneur startups face in the local markets, and how Hassan VC has tailored its support? Probably we can see tailor the support to startups so they can maintain ethical standards without sacrificing their market competitiveness.
Yes. So again, I don't think there is a trade-off per se between being ethical, being halal, and commercial strength or viability. In fact, we believe that it comes together. Nonetheless, there are definitely challenges in trying to be ethical, right? Sometimes there are opportunities for, sort of easy money or quick wins that may not be too ethical, right? So then for those kind of opportunities, ethical startups will have to miss them and let go of them. But I would say that, although they may be seen to be opportunities in the short term, but in the long term, most likely it's not going to bring benefit to the startup itself, right? So while there's a little bit of this kind of loss, but I think the loss is outweighed by the long-term benefit of being true and ethical. Now, so with that said, startups really need to dig deep, and founders need to always have front and center the reason for their existence and the reason for them doing this. And we see that most founders that come to us, they have a much deeper reason for what they are doing and why they are doing it. It's not just to make money, but it's also to leave, in many cases, to leave a legacy. And that's a mindset that we try to share also with our founders. You are here to build your business for future generations, right? Whether your business lasts a very long time or not is out of our control. You can only try your best. But with that mindset of building a generational business, then naturally you will have principles intact.
And we know it's not only the founders, the entrepreneurs, and even the startups are facing challenges or regulatory changes. And we know that accelerator programs like Hassan VC also face unique regulatory challenges. Probably you can share with us, how do you address these regulatory changes that faced by halal business, especially in different countries of Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think maybe in Islamic finance specifically, right? When you have startups that are in fintech, there would be some potential difficulty in going into different markets that may have differentiated Sharia principles or frameworks. But the fundamentals remain the same. So if you're not going to very, technical and tricky areas, then generally what we see is that a startup can quite easily expand to other countries or serve other countries based on the basic halal framework. Usually there's no issue there, right? Unless, for example, Islamic banks, where different countries have very, very strict and very, very specific ways of doing things, then it could be more challenging. But for startups, so far, what we see is there is no big issue, there's no big challenge. And outside of finance, especially, something that's halal is generally accepted as halal in most parts of the world.
Are there any, we can say, accelerator programs should integrate into their offerings, such as mentorships or even partnership with the key halal certifications bodies?
Yeah, I think that's something that we've always tried to do, and it's very important. The halal ecosystem, especially regulators and bodies, I see, especially in the last few years, right, we see that they have become much more open and much more welcoming to innovations, to dealing with new parties, new ideas, new technology. Pre-pandemic, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was very, very tough. The gap in the way things were viewed is very, very significant. But that has gone away. It's largely gone away. And I commend, for example, the different religious authorities in the states, in Malaysia, because we see that they are very actively welcoming such change. And startups and founders are also actively reaching out to sharing and educating the stakeholders so that there's more alignment and there's more comfort, right? This year, and especially, I can't mention too much in terms of projects that we are aware of, but next year there are going to be a lot of, I would say, breakthrough projects where the religious authorities as well as startups are working together hand in hand.
With the growing emphasis on ethical consumerism, maybe you can share with us, where do you see the halal startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia over the next 5 to 10 years, Umar?
All right. Very important question, because it's not just about consuming ethically, but it's about producing ethically as well, right? Because we are here working on the startups, the producers, the businesses that are creating products and providing services. So we know today that there is a need for a much more ethical way of doing business and products and services that come out of these businesses. Southeast Asia, with Malaysia as the hub for the Islamic economy, we see that it's a very suitable source or region for production. When I say production here, it's not manufacturing, it's startups, right? So producing technology solutions from here is something that has regional and global potential because we have many advantages, right? We have robust ecosystem, we have talent, our cost structure is significantly lower than for example, the GCC, the Middle East, and in the West. So we can produce good products here. We have a good market. We can test, iterate, and enhance and improve our product or offering. And then from there, it can go overseas. And we have seen, a lot of such connections and bridges starting to be built. Like, it's still early days, but we can see that happening. Specifically, we see it between Malaysia and Saudi, for example, also with Qatar, right? So there is this kind of bridges being built and this kind of cross-border business happening, especially in the startup world.
And how can halal startup position themselves to not only meet the demand of the current, we can say, current situation, but also anticipate in the future shift in the ethical consumer trends?
All right. So this part is very important, right? Because for startups, the approach is, or the approach that we propagate is, you need to be very, very sensitive to the needs of your customers and your market, and to be able to quickly adjust to serve the market, right? So ethical consumerism has been here for a very long time, but in the past 1 year especially, it has been booming due to, let's just say, geopolitics. And this may accelerate because things are not getting better. So, for a startup, it's really about pushing it out there. For example, there is a fintech app in the UK, right? Not here, that allows investors to actually see what percentage of their investments go into certain types of companies that they may not want their money to go to. Right? So this with APIs, with open banking, with the general opening up of the market, a lot of data can be extracted from there. So my point here is that startups need to be very, very sensitive and need to listen to the customers and listen to the market so that we can continue to serve the market. And especially in this case, when it comes to ethics, we can make sure that we're on point in that regard.
And Umar, maybe lastly, I want to add one more question. With the rise of digital platforms, how might e-commerce and online strategy marketing, so we can see, evolve to meet the needs of ethical consumers in the Southeast Asia market?
All right. Personally, our view is that the approach to marketing today is generally not too sustainable. Here specifically, I'm referring to spending on ads on big media, big social media platforms, search engines, and so on. A lot of money goes there. Whereas when it comes to, for example, in this case, ethical consumerism, it is a very community-based thing, right? So my view and what we propagate is that it should be focused on networks, communities, collaborations, and partnerships instead, over just throwing money at ads to get traction, right? So this is a much more targeted, sustainable way, because it can potentially create what is called a network effect, where word of mouth builds up and snowballs, and more people come together because they feel connected to what you are doing and they want to be part of it. Right? So this is what we see as the opportunity for startups today, instead of just doing the traditional or typical kind of ads expenditure.
All right, again, I would say thank you very much to our guest, Umar Munshi, the managing partner, Hassan VC, for helping us understand from the perspective of accelerator programs on how they boost the startup entrepreneurs, especially, and how can they balance between revenue pressures with ethical integrity in the future. And definitely that is the main aspect that we are focusing on. And again, I would say thank you very much, Umar, and I hope to see you again. And definitely all of our discussion here will be featured in AstroAwani.com and across all social media platforms.
Penyasaran subsidi diesel di Semenanjung tidak akan memberi kesan kepada harga barangan keperluan di Sabah, Sarawak dan Labuan.
660 individu berusia bawah 21 tahun di Sarawak telah diberikan kewarganegaraan.
Sarawak kini menjalinkan kerjasama dengan Bank Dunia dalam menjayakan perdagangan karbonnya.
Hi, good day to you. Welcome to another episode of ASEAN Kita, where we will unravel some obscure issues related to ASEAN, and we will also explore some unique and diverse cultures of some of the ASEAN nations. But for this particular episode, Amirul, as we look towards Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship in 2025, the dynamics of our regional partnerships take on even greater significance. One such partnership is with Australia, which has played a pivotal role in ASEAN's journey since becoming its first dialogue partner back in 1974. And over the decades, the ASEAN-Australia relationship has grown to encompass wide-ranging cooperation across ASEAN's three pillars, which are political security, economic, and also socio-cultural.
So today we are honoured to have Dr. John Lee, and he's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and also was a former senior advisor to the Australian Foreign Minister. Dr. Lee has extensive knowledge on the economic advance of Asia-Pacific regions and specific focus on ASEAN and China of Australia's relationship with the Southeast Asia region. And his insights into trade, geopolitics, and also regional stability are highly sought after, and which makes him a perfect guest in ASEAN Kita, Farhan. Definitely. So welcome to the show, Dr. Lee. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Lee, so the first question is, Australia has become ASEAN's first dialogue partner in 1974, and making it the beginning of a formal relationship aimed at fostering economic and political and also cultural ties. So this partnership was initially motivated by regional security and also concerns during the Cold War, and has evolved significantly over the decades. So what are the key areas of cooperation between Australia and ASEAN since it's become ASEAN's first dialogue in 1974, Dr. Lee?
If you look at why Australia became the first dialogue partner, Australia emerged after World War II. Its traditional economic partners, the United Kingdom and also United States, they were still important, but geography is permanent. And Australia realised that it was in the Asian region. So it had to find its way in the Asian region. Now, Australia is a large continent, but it's a small population. So if we want to be prosperous, we need trade. We need to sell things around the world and to Asia. And it became apparent then, and it's apparent now, that if there is instability in Southeast Asia, we cannot be prosperous because most of our trade goes through Southeast Asia. In fact, almost all of our trade goes through Southeast Asia. In ASEAN, our leaders back then, I think they realised that ASEAN was there to maintain the peace and a rivalry between the ASEAN countries, to maintain the rivalries and make sure they were under control. So Australia supported the mission of ASEAN right from the beginning. Now, since then, Australia's role with ASEAN and in Southeast Asia more broadly, it's not just trade. Australia is a very important development partner. It's quite a strong champion for ASEAN to a lot of our traditional allies, the United States, United Kingdom, and it now encompasses a lot of educational links, a lot of people-to-people links. I think the business-to-business links between Australia and Southeast Asia is still underdone, and I think there's a lot more potential there. So looking ahead in the future, Australia, not just through ASEAN, but ASEAN will be important for Australia to increase our people-to-people and business-to-business links in Southeast Asia, not just in Northeast Asia.
Well, Australia's partnership with ASEAN has also evolved to the level of a comprehensive strategic partner in 2021. As a comprehensive strategic partner, how has Australia demonstrated some of tangible progress in addressing ASEAN's regional challenges such as economic inequality and security threats, such as the current ones. The most fractious thing about Malaysia and some of ASEAN nations with China is when it comes to the South China Sea. They want to be seen as a new leader in the region. So how does Australia demonstrated and address these problems?
In my view, Australia has quite a realistic view of ASEAN and ASEAN's role. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, Australian leaders have consistently reaffirmed ASEAN centrality. And what that means in my mind, and I think in the Australian mind, is that ASEAN is well placed to lead the regional conversations about strategic affairs. ASEAN is centrally placed to be the host of discussions and forums, not just with ASEAN states, but between the great powers and between the Chinese, the Americans, the Japanese, and also the claimant states. So from that point of view, on the one hand, Australia has recognised that ASEAN has this central diplomatic role to play. On the other hand, in my view, Australia is also realistic that ASEAN is composed of 10 member states. Those member states have different interests. So therefore, when it comes to geostrategy or geopolitics, the member states within ASEAN themselves have quite different interests or at least approaches. And therefore, ASEAN as such is not a strategic actor. It is more an entity to bring the relevant players together. That doesn't mean that problems will be solved or easily solved, but it is an important step to at least get the right voices in the room to discuss these issues. So I think that's Australia's view of the role of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality.
Dr. Lee, given the emphasis on mutual trust and also shared interests, how does or how should Australia navigate potential conflict of interest within the member states of ASEAN, particularly when member states have differing stances on major geopolitical issues like the China's and US rivalry? So we have Philippines who are very vocal against China, and also we have Vietnam who has contentious history with the China. So thoughts, Dr. Lee?
I begin with the proposition that China is an essential part of the region, that the mutual prosperity of Asia cannot continue without China being a central part of that. However, my view is also that China is a very ambitious and in some respects quite a revisionist power when it comes to changing some of the status quo in the region. So the key question is, how do we manage that? Now, with the ASEAN nations, as you mentioned, they all have different approaches and also have different histories, geographies, but also relationships. So Philippines, a treaty ally, and as we all know, the Philippines has re-emphasized its alliance with the United States. This is in contrast to other countries that are not formal treaty allies like Malaysia. My personal view is that countries can play different roles in keeping the peace. So, for example, I wouldn't expect Malaysia to take the same, you might say, confrontational attitude to China in the South China Sea. But Philippines, in taking this role and working with the Americans, and I would say also the Australians and Japanese, that does create some reassuring constraints on the Chinese. And in a sense, countries like Malaysia and other countries like Thailand and Indonesia, they can play a more middle role because other countries take those risks to put some constraints on Chinese behaviour. Now, none of this works perfectly or smoothly, but I suppose my point is that I believe countries within Southeast Asia, within the ASEAN setup, can play different roles to ensure ultimately stability and continued prosperity.
What are those roles?
Well, international politics is a mixture of diplomacy, but also of balancing and hard power. So my view of the region is that countries like Japan, Australia, Philippines, but possibly South Korea, as well as the United States, plays the more balancing hard power roles. But there are other countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, perhaps Singapore, who can play a more middling diplomatic role. And those things will not ever perfectly align, but all those countries play their own individual roles based on their own history and based on their own capabilities to ensure that differences never get out of hand. So I value the role of the Philippines, but I also value the role of countries like Malaysia, who also try to play a mediating or middle role in the region, given these difficult disagreements.
Well, considering the shifting global power dynamics, back in the past we regard US as the main superpower, but now it's shifting to China. And, at times Malaysia uses the sobriquet of Abang Besar or Abang Long, or, the big brother of Asia, because looking at how, the power is shifting towards China. So, how can Australia work with ASEAN to ensure that, external powers like China do not exploit divisions within the region while still fostering a stable and prosperous environment?
It's a good question because, to be frank, China has been quite successful, in my view, at exploiting divisions within ASEAN. ASEAN, as we know, depends very much on a consensus model, and when there's no consensus, ASEAN finds it difficult to take a position on issues. And so because there are differences of views of how to deal with China, but also on the South China Sea dispute within ASEAN itself, my view is that China has understandably used that to its advantage to deal with ASEAN, but prevent ASEAN from issuing any strong statements or taking a strong position against the Chinese activities. Now, to answer your question, what can we do about that? Well, one suggestion, which I know will be perhaps heretical for a lot of ASEAN member states, is that consensus should be important, but it shouldn't be mandatory. So one of the roles that ASEAN has, and one of the great powers that ASEAN has, is the power to approve or sanction diplomatically. I'm not talking about using hard power or coercion, but diplomatically and morally, if you like. And I have often been frustrated that ASEAN has not been able to issue statements or positions because there hasn't been consensus. Now, consensus within ASEAN itself, I don't think is possible because countries have too many different interests. So my suggestion is that rather than make consensus a mandatory element, just like we've done with reforms in juries and court systems, perhaps a position of 9 out of 10 or could be sufficient, or 8 out of 10 could be sufficient for ASEAN to formally take a stance. Now, as I mentioned, I know this will be quite a heretical thing for an outsider to say about ASEAN, but my interest here is to ensure that ASEAN retains its relevance and role as tensions get deeper and deeper, particularly between the great powers. And if ASEAN cannot find a voice because it's insisting on consensus, my fear is that ASEAN gradually will lose its central diplomatic role. So I would like a central role for ASEAN. My argument is that ASEAN needs to modify a little bit to maintain that central diplomatic role, which it has played so successfully over many decades.
Dr. Lee, ASEAN has always remained neutral in terms of China-US rivalry, but how has ASEAN's approach to neutrality evolved or transformed since its inception, particularly in recent geopolitical tensions or shifts in Indo-Pacific? And what specific challenges has ASEAN's faced since the rise of China and US-China rivalry posed to ASEAN's stance towards neutrality?
In many respects, and although I'm born in Malaysia, I'm no longer Malaysian. I'm Australian, so I'm saying this as an outsider. But Southeast Asians and ASEAN have a very difficult situation because, on the one hand, many Southeast Asians, well, 5 Southeast Asian claimant states, essentially have differences with China. So from that point of view, there are Southeast Asian states that cannot remain neutral because they actually have interests. It doesn't mean they're confrontational, but they are not formally neutral because they have claims against other states, including China. But on the other hand, ASEAN, as you say, has to maintain a level of neutrality for it to become the accepted convener of discussion and strategic debate, and for great powers to accept ASEAN having that role. So my suggestion, I suppose, is that ASEAN can remain neutral in the sense that ASEAN can still become the organisation that brings the countries in dispute together, Southeast Asian countries and other countries. But ASEAN countries themselves cannot actually remain neutral. The last thing I would say, though, is that remaining neutral doesn't mean avoiding difficult issues. So I think for ASEAN to become more relevant rather than less relevant as strategic competition deepens in the region, the ASEAN forums, the East Asia Summit, for example, ASEAN +3, the ASEAN member states, and particularly the ASEAN chair, they do need to have the courage to put difficult issues on the agenda. It may not be resolved, but not putting these issues on the agenda just drives them underground, and I think it actually makes tensions in the region even worse. So I'm hopeful next year and the year after that difficult issues, including South China Sea, will be on the agenda, and I'd rather have the claimants argue it out at ASEAN Forum than seek to resolve it in their favour in other ways.
Okay. Well, there has been a fascinating discussion with Dr. John Lee on ASEAN's role on the global economy and what lies ahead for the region. But we'll take a short break now and stay tuned with us at ASEAN Kita.
Bersatu pertahankan hutan kita!
Kau tak takut ke? Sejarah berulang kembali.
Hi, welcome back to ASEAN Kita. We have Dr. John Lee. We were discussing about Australia's role in the ASEAN region. Now let's dive back in with our question. Beyond, you mentioned forums just now. Beyond existing forums like the East Asia Summit and ASEAN Regional Forum, what new diplomatic initiative or mechanisms could ASEAN introduce to strengthen its role as an impartial mediator?
One possibility, I think, is that the 5 claimant states within ASEAN, under ASEAN approval, could get together and agree, not on the actual territories, because they may not agree, but agree on at least the principles of how to prevent escalation between themselves, but also with China. And I would emphasize preventing escalation doesn't mean backing down every time. Preventing escalation means that you come up with a series of
solutions.
Yeah, of behaviours and approaches. And something that goes beyond the code of conduct discussions that have been taking place between China and ASEAN for a long time with no resolution. It's more that there needs to be much more of a direct appeal to the Chinese, but also a direct, I could even use the word demand to the Chinese to agree to more reasonable measures. And to emphasise, ASEAN doesn't have any coercive power, but it does have the power of condemnation. And ASEAN should be prepared to use that if countries don't behave in ways that preserve stability.
Dr. Lee, given ASEAN's growing economic clout, how can the bloc use its collective economic weight to shape regional dynamics without affecting its or compromising its neutrality? And what specific economic initiatives or policies could reinforce ASEAN's position as a neutral yet influential player in the region?
I would say ASEAN as an economic zone undoubtedly has growing economic clout.
Sure.
But I wouldn't consider ASEAN a unified economic actor as such. But having said that, what ASEAN can do, and it's already doing this, is it can put forward important and practical visions for what the region needs. So, for example, ASEAN has a digital connectivity agenda. Right? That's practical, but it's also meaningful. What I personally would like to see in that is ASEAN come up with some agreement amongst themselves as to what appropriate digital standards ought to be, what appropriate standards for data protection ought to be, and then engage more powerfully with the big players, United States, Europe, China, on trying to get these sorts of standards and regimes to become the norm. So I think as an economic zone or economic power, ASEAN, it's not a unified economic power, but it can set standards and rules if there's agreement amongst ASEAN states themselves. Now, that's a difficult conversation because if ASEAN did such a thing, the great powers would try to use its influence to influence what direction ASEAN goes. But I think ASEAN has to stick to its positions. It has to, on these sorts of non-military strategic things, it has to remain unified and then present that unified front to the great powers.
Well, let's touch some contentious issues like Palestine and Israel. How do you perceive Malaysia's obvious firm stance and Anwar's, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim's vocal advocacy for Palestine's sovereign rights as a state affecting the dynamics within ASEAN, especially with countries like Singapore?
Yeah. Well, Malaysia is an Islamic state or Islamic majority state, so I do understand Malaysia's position on the Israel-Palestine issue. However, what I would say is that if religious or any other identity drives foreign policy too much, one should always remember that other member states don't necessarily share your identity.
Sure.
So the more outward or the more forward-leaning Malaysia is on this issue, there runs the risk that the more it is by itself or with a small number of other countries, it will become on this issue. Look, every country has a right to advocate for a position on any issue at once, but there's always a tension between going out on your own and trying to preserve an element of stability and harmony with your neighbours. So I think that balance needs to be considered in terms of any advocacy taken by Malaysia or otherwise on this issue.
Dr. Lee, as we approach ASEAN's 60th anniversary in 2027 and looking ahead to 2030, what potential geopolitical shifts, for example, the rise of India, technological disruptions and also climate change impacts might significantly impact ASEAN's role or the need to adapt to its approach to neutrality in order to remain relevant and effective in these possible scenarios, Dr. Lee?
One of the big threats I see happening is on the economic supply chain and technological front. I mean, the height of ASEAN's influence and relevance, in my mind, was really the sort of 1990s and 2000s. And this was a time when geopolitics took a back seat. The world was starting to become more open, more globalized. The logic of economics overrode the logic of geopolitics and geostrategy. I think that world is fading. And therefore, ASEAN needs to adapt. And a specific example of this is that we can see already that there's not a hard decoupling going on between the West and China, but in a lot of technological areas, there is a decoupling occurring and it will accelerate. So ASEAN has to remain ahead of this. ASEAN has to look at what its position is on this kind of decoupling that's occurring, rather than pretending that it isn't occurring. Look, there will be situations where ASEAN, or at least member states, will essentially have to choose. And what I mean by that is they will have to choose, for example, which technological ecosystem they want to enter. And they don't, or because entering one means that you cannot enter another. I would prefer to see ASEAN be ahead of these issues, or at least think about their positions on these issues, think about the sort of principles they actually want to adhere to and the standards they want to uphold, and then choose accordingly. But they will have to choose.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So that was Dr. John Lee, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former senior advisor to the Australian minister, sharing his insights and perspectives on ASEAN's evolving role and what the future lies ahead for the region. And I guess that's pretty much all that we have for today. Thank you for joining us. To our viewers, thank you for joining us today. I'm Amirul Aiman.
I am Farhan Hakimi. See you.